All right, the Most High be praised. This time we want to prepare ourselves for our class session. Bless the Almighty. I want to say shalom to all of you that are here and to all of you who are gathering with us by live stream. We thank you also for your attendance. Our class is Biblical World History, and today we are covering Lesson 11. We're going to be looking at the divided kingdom, and that would be the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Yahuwah. And before we dig right into it, let's bow our heads in a word of prayer. Abba, thank you for your goodness and your graciousness to us, for another opportunity to be able to provide teaching to your Talmudim, your disciples. I pray, Father, that this teaching would help to illuminate your servants, that it would give them understanding and insight into this portion of history that is very important, to see how you worked in bringing about your purposes. We thank you in advance and ask that you give clarity and that you would give understanding to each one in attendance. We bless you in Messiah's great name. Amen. Yeah. So as we get into this lesson, I want to say some things about what was covered in Lesson 10, because Lesson 10, which covers King David and King Solomon, is significant because that leads us into this lesson that we're going to be covering today. Picking up on the tail end of Lesson 10, we had discussed King Solomon's departure from the Most High, in that he began to worship other deities. So I want our attention to go to 1 Kings. We're going to go back to 1 Kings chapter 11. That's where we ended in Lesson 10. We want to look at that. We're going to go to the 11th chapter of 1 Kings. And we're going to go to the 11th verse. At this particular time, King Solomon is an old man, and his heart turned from following the way of Elohim. He did not do as his father David did in striving to follow the Most High in everything. He loved his wives a bit too much and built shrines and temples to the Elohim of the other nations. So when we look at the 11th verse of 1 Kings chapter 11, this is what it says. And we're going to read through to verse 13. It says, "Therefore Yahuwah said to Solomon, since this has been your mind, and you have not kept my covenant and my statutes that I have commanded you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. Yet for the sake of your father David, I will not do it in your lifetime. I will tear it out of the hand of your son. I will not, however, tear away the entire kingdom. I will give one tribe to your son for the sake of my servant David and for the sake of Jerusalem, which I have chosen. So what we see here at the end of Solomon's life, because of his change of direction, his departure from the Most High and worshiping other Elohim, it was the cause of the divided kingdom. And we see after Solomon's death, his son Rehoboam becomes king. We find that in the 12th chapter of 1 Kings and in the first verse. 12th chapter, first verse, it says, Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had come to Shechem to make him king. So now, with Rehoboam being king, he followed a policy that was more stringent than his father. And in his policy, he intended to put pressure and heavy burdens on the people. However, at this particular time, the people were not going to have it. They were not going to allow themselves to be under an oppressive leader. And of course, this was all Yah's doing. And what we find is that when Rehoboam wanted to oppress the people by sending one of his officials, we find that the people stoned one of his officials. And that caused Rehoboam to go back to Jerusalem and recognize that he did not have control over the people as he thought he had. And with that occurring, Jeroboam, who was a servant to King Solomon, he now is chosen by the people as a leader. But the Most High had spoke to Jeroboam and had told him that he was going to be king and that there would be 10 tribes that would be given to him. We find that in the 31st verse of chapter 11. So let's go to chapter 11. We want to look at verse 31. And here we're going to see where the Most High speaks to him. So in the 31st verse of chapter 11, 1 Kings, we're still in 1 Kings, it says, he then said to Jeroboam, take for yourself 10 pieces, for thus says Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, see, I am about to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and will give you 10 tribes. Okay, so here the prophet comes to Jeroboam, tells him that he is going to be given 10 of the tribes of Israel to be king over. Once Jeroboam becomes king, in accomplishing what the Most High had intended, Jeroboam felt, as most kings do, that he needed to secure his position of authority among the people. Now, Elohim showed up to Jeroboam, told him he was going to give him 10 tribes. Jeroboam's responsibility at that point was to seek the counsel of the Almighty and to trust the Almighty to direct him, just as David did. One of the things that I do want to note when we look at King David and we want to compare the other kings to King David, what we see in David's life is that when Yahuwah raised up David and put him in that position, David was consistent about going before Yahuwah to ask for counsel and direction. Even after King Saul died, first thing David does is he says, should I go up to Hebron? You know, he asked the question, should I go up? Before he does anything. You know, Saul's already dead. David could have just said, all right, look, I'm just going to go ahead and take this. This is mine now. I've already been anointed by Yah, so might as well go ahead and take this. No, first thing he does, even though he knows that he is going to be king, he says, Yahuwah, should I go up? What we see in King David's heart is the humility to seek Elohim for counsel. He doesn't do anything without first consulting the Almighty, because he realized that even though he was king, he was the servant of Elohim. Now, Jeroboam wanted to secure his position. And so he began to notice that the tribes of Israel were going down to Jerusalem to worship. Now, it was not the intent of the Most High that with the divided kingdom, that the people in northern Israel would stop going to Jerusalem to the temple to worship. But Jeroboam, acting like most earthly kings act, that focus on how do I preserve my kingdom? How do I keep what I have? Okay. Now, mind you, he wouldn't have thought about being king if the Most High had not come to him and told him what he was going to do. All right. But now, since he's in a position of power, as most people do, they begin to start thinking about, how do I secure my position? He's seeing the people go down to Jerusalem and immediately begins to feel that if they go down to Jerusalem, it's possible that they may develop an allegiance for King Rehoboam. He didn't want that. So what he does, he introduces idolatry into Israel. He sets up 2 golden calves for the people to worship. They set up a temple in northern Israel. So here we have a corrupted religious system that is created now. This was not the intent of the Almighty. This is not what the Most High wanted Jeroboam to do. But this is what we see happening. And as a result of this, the Most High, he gives some serious consequences to Jeroboam. Now, if you look over at 1 Kings chapter 12, verses 25 through 33, and I'm not going to read that, but I just wanted us to note the placement in scripture where Jeroboam introduced idolatry to Israel. It's found in the 12th chapter of Kings, verses 25 through 33. And that section is where you find the information about what Jeroboam did. But when we look over in 1 Kings chapter 14, here is where we see the consequences that were laid upon Jeroboam because of his guiding the house of Israel down a path of idolatry. Okay. We want to look at verse number 7. I'm going to read verse 7 through to verse 10. All right. And it says, "Go tell Jeroboam, thus says Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, because I exalted you from among the people, made you a leader over my people Israel, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David to give it to you. Yet you have not been like my servant David." Okay. First Kings chapter 14. Chapter 14. Did everybody get the chapter? Okay. Okay, everybody got the chapter now?
No.
First Kings chapter 14, verse 7 is where I began reading. I said chapter 14. I know I said chapter 14.
We said 13. We said 13.
All right. 14. Thank you for the correction. Thank you for the correction. Chapter 14, 1-4. All right. Verse 7. "Go tell Jeroboam, thus says Yahuwah, the Elohim of Israel, because I exalted you from among the people, made you leader over my people Israel, and tore the kingdom away from the house of David to give it to you. Yet you have not been like my servant David," or David, "who kept my commandments and followed me with all his heart, doing only that which was right in my sight. But you have done evil above all those who were before you, and have gone and made for yourselves other Elohim, and cast images, provoking me to anger, and have thrust me behind your back." I'm going to pause for a moment. Now here, the Most High is speaking to Jeroboam through the prophet, and he is telling him that I made you to be king. And we can see that it was the intent of the Almighty that Jeroboam seek him for guidance, that he would seek the Most High for counsel, not become like other kings to try and secure their position and follow a path that was only concerned about securing power. The Most High had consequences. So here it is, verse 10. He says, "Therefore," this is what's going to happen to Jeroboam. "Therefore, I will bring evil upon the house of Jeroboam. I will cut off from Jeroboam every male, both bond and free in Israel, and will consume the house of Jeroboam, just as one burns up dung until it is all gone." Now, the consequences for being disobedient to the commandments of Elohim are very, very serious. Mm-hmm. We see this here. Elohim raised up this man, but once he was put in power, he began to take the reins himself. And as the Most High said here, he says, "You threw me behind your back. You thrust me behind your back." Mm-hmm. He said, "I'm the one who put you in this position. Mm-hmm. But now what you have done, you have forgotten about me. You've thrown me out." And what we see with this situation is something that is a primary example, and it's a negative example, mm-hmm. of what many believers who are placed in positions of power do. We know in the scriptures that Elohim is the one who exalts. He is the one who raises up. He is the one who brings down. When Elohim raises up, it is now the responsibility of the person who has been exalted to humble themselves before Elohim and seek his guidance, not to begin to view themselves as a person that has put themselves in power and then trying to figure out how to secure that power so that it cannot be taken from them. That thinking comes from a mentality that believes that the individual was the one responsible for putting themselves in a place of prominence. That's where you forget about who put you where you are. It's so very important as servants of Elohim that when the Most High raises us up, that is to make us prominent before people, that we never forget that it was Elohim's doing.
Yes.
And that we should never begin to feel as though we need to somehow come up with a plan or strategy to try to secure our position. Our goal should be to always seek the counsel of the Almighty. Always. You have many people who, when they reach a place of prominence, they do the same thing Jeroboam did. They throw the Most High back. They're like, oh, I'm here now. Let me work some deals with prominent men and women of the earth. All right? Okay. We find this attitude right here. And what happened is that it caused a spirit now to enter into the northern kingdom that would ultimately end in the destruction of the northern kingdom and the captivity that would come upon the people some centuries later. Now, I want to give a listing of the kings of the northern kingdom Israel and also the kings of the southern kingdom Judah. We have a lot of kings here. As we list the kings of the northern kingdom, one of the things that we will note, at least, that is distinct from the southern kingdom is that most of the kings in northern Israel are wicked kings. And the basic reason for that is because they are left with this idolatrous religious system that is guiding and directing them. Anytime you have a wicked religious system, you open the door for the demonic kingdom to now guide and direct. And this is what they had. They had a wicked system. It was idolatrous. And that opened the door for them to continue in a direction that was completely opposed to the way of the Creator. So let me go ahead and name these kings. We have Nadab. This is the king, and I'm naming the kings in successive order. After Jeroboam, we have Nadab, Baasha, Ela, Zimri, Omri. Then we have Ahab. So the seventh king we have, starting from Jeroboam in the north, is Ahab. Ahab married a woman by the name of Jezebel. Now, when Ahab married this woman, he married a woman who was a Baal. Let me use that term. We say Baal, but it's Baal. She was a worshiper of Baal. And if my memory serves me right, she was a priestess. In other words, she knew the religion of Baal from its ins and outs. So when she married Ahab, she introduced the system of Baal worship into Israel. So at first, Israel, their idolatry system was the worship of the two calves. Now, those two calves represented Elohim, all right? And for those of you who might not be familiar with the name for a calf, what we call an ox, that ox is called an El. The term Aleph is an ox head, all right? So when we look at the Aleph, which is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph is an ox head. That's what it is. So when you look at the ox, that's the Aleph, the El. Okay. So when Jeroboam had these two calves made, he said, "These are your Elohim." So among the pagan worshipers, the ox, the statue of the ox, was the appropriate symbol to represent the deity because it represents the strong one. All right? Does that make sense?
Yes, sir.
So what had happened here was that Jeroboam had broken the command of Elohim, where the Most High said, "I don't want you to make any graven images of me or that reflect me." And that's what they had done. It was they basically had taken what they already knew about Elohim and his commandments, but they have mixed it now with the images. But when Ahab marries Jezebel, we have a whole new religious system being introduced. Now with Baal worship, you have the worship also of Ashtarte. See, this Baal worship has all of those Babylonian elements in it as well. Okay? So in Baal worship, Baal was regarded as the deity of light or sun deity. So just kind of give you an idea of some of the practices that were involved in Israel at this time. You had the Winter Solstice that was going on during this time, which is the 21st of December to the 25th of December. That was a part of the Baal worship. They had a whole priesthood that was in operation. Now, this Baal worship was very similar to the Babylonian pagan system of worship and also the Egyptian or the Mitzrayim system of worship with Isis, Osiris, and Horus. Okay, that's very similar to Baal and Ashtaroth. So you have this system of worship that is very ancient. All of it comes out of Babylon, that which Nimrod had created when they were constructing the Tower of Babel. You had this form of religion now operating in the northern kingdom of Israel. And it was during this particular time of Ahab and Jezebel that the prophet Eliah, who we commonly call Elijah, shows up on the scene, right? And I'm not going to talk a whole lot about Elijah because in our next lesson, we're going to talk about the prophets of the divided kingdom. But right now, we're just talking about the kings. But I wanted to just point out this particular individual because this is a prominent person in the history. He was a wicked king, and with marrying this Jezebel, they introduced some things in Israel that made Israel more corrupt. Okay. So now, after Ahab, we have Ahaziah. Then we have Jehoram. Then we have Yehu. Then we have Jehoahaz. Then we have Jehoash. Then we have Jeroboam II. Then we have Zechariah, Sholem, Menachem. We have Pekahiah, Pekah, and the last king of the northern kingdom is Hoshea. So in the reign of Hoshea is when the kingdom of Assyria comes into the northern kingdom. And they take the northern kingdom into captivity. The date in which the captivity occurred was in 722 BCE. So that's an important date to note. 722 BCE. So we're looking at roughly almost a little more than 200 years that has transpired since the time of King Solomon. About little more than 200 years. And we find the kingdom of Israel taken into captivity. All right? That's not a long time. All right? First king that Israel had was Saul. Then David was the first Judean king. And then we have Shlomo, Solomon. And then we have the divided kingdom, and all of these kingdoms are kings in the north. So the kings of Israel in the north, because of their wickedness, caused them to be taken into captivity. Now, let's look at the kingdom of Yahuwah, or Judah. After King Rehoboam, and I do need to note something that I didn't note. I apologize for this, but the one tribe that was given to Rehoboam was the tribe of Judah. Over in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 20, let me just note that real quick. I'm backing up. I'm sorry, but I do need to note it. But in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 20, it says, when all Israel heard that Jeroboam had returned, they sent and called him to the assembly and made him king over all Israel. There was no one who followed the house of David except the tribe of Judah alone. Okay. Now, even though the text says that the tribe of Judah was the only one that followed Rehoboam, and even though the Most High said only one tribe would be given to Rehoboam, when we read verse 21, we're going to find out that that southern kingdom actually was composed of two tribes. In verse 21 of chapter 12 of 1 Kings, it says, when Rehoboam came to Jerusalem, he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin. Y'all see that? It says that he assembled all the house of Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, 180,000 chosen troops to fight against the house of Israel, to restore the kingdom to Rehoboam, the son of Solomon. Now, in this verse, what we see, or what we have evidence of, is that the southern kingdom of Judah was composed of not just the tribe of Judah, but also the tribe of Benjamin or Benjamin, right? And as we look at the history of the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, we find that the southern kingdom actually has two tribes. Even though the Most High said one, it actually has two tribes. It has Judah and Benjamin, okay? But I just wanted to make that notation because the Most High said, I'm only giving one tribe to Rehoboam. We find that as history moves on, that there were actually two tribes in the south. All right, so now we're going to proceed with the king of the kingdom of Judah. After Rehoboam, we have Abiya, sometimes called Abijah. But when we say it in Hebrew, it's Abiya. The I in the names, you do not pronounce it I. You know, like Malachi, you know, or like Levi. You don't pronounce the I as I in the letter. It's a yod, but you pronounce it as an E. That's how you pronounce it. So anytime you see that I in the letter, which is the yod, it's an E. So you would say Abiya. All right. You would say instead, when you say, instead of saying Levi, you would say, no, it's not Levi, it would be Levi. You don't say I when you're pronouncing the yod. The yod is generally seen by the letter I in English. So when I pronounce these names, for the most part, I'm going to be pronouncing them Hebraically. Okay. So if you're accustomed to hearing these names in English with that I, no, that's not the way it's done. Okay. So we have the first king after Rehoboam. We have Abiya. Then we have Asa. Then we have Yehoshaphat. Then we have Jehoram. Now, some of these names are the same names as some of the kings of Israel. You'll see the same names. Like Jehoram, you have a Jehoram who was a king in the northern kingdom. All right. Then we have Ahaziah. Then we have Athaliah. Now, Athaliah was the only queen in Judah. Now, this Athaliah, she was the daughter of Ahab and Jezebel. Now, we find that when you have people who descend from a family that is idolatrous, that they carry the same spirit. Athaliah carried the same spirit of her mama and daddy, especially her mama. All right. She came along and she married one of these Judean kings. But what happened was that when that king died, she came to the throne. So now we have an infiltration here of paganism coming into Judah. All right. This is important because Judah was doing real good for a short time. But after a while, Judah began to follow the same religious practices as the northern kingdom followed. Same practices. But we can see the introduction of that with this woman coming in. to the southern kingdom. All right. Then we have Joash. And we have Amaziah or Amaziah. Then we have Uzziah. You know, Uzziah, we say Uzziah. There's a passage in Yeshayahu, Isaiah, where he says, in the year that Uzziah died, I saw Yahuwah. So here we see the name of one of the kings of Judah, whose reign lasted up until the prophet Yeshayahu, right? The next king after Uzziah is Jotham or Yotham. Then there's Ahaz. Then there's Ezekiah, commonly called Hezekiah, Hezekiah, or Hezekiah. And then there is Manasseh. Then Ammon. Then there is Josiah, commonly called Josiah or Josiah. He was a good king. Then there was Jehoahaz. Then Jehoiakim. And then there is Jehoiakim, sometimes pronounced Jehoiachin. And then there's Zedekiah. Zedekiah, or Zedekiah is most commonly called. He was the last king of the southern kingdom. It was during the reign of Zedekiah that the Babylonians came in and took the southern kingdom into captivity. Now, the captivity of the southern kingdom didn't occur all at once. It was over a period of time, roughly about 11 years, from 597 to 586 BCE. So we have roughly like about 125, almost to 130 something years that we have the southern kingdom still functioning as a kingdom. So that lasted a little longer. But they also began to worship other Elohim. When we look in the book of the prophet Jeremiah, when we look in the book of that prophet and in the book of the prophet Ezekiel, when we look in the books of those prophets, they give us a real clear picture of the paganism that the southern kingdom had steeped themselves into. We have a situation where there were what's noted as 25 men that were at the temple, and they had their backs toward the temple, and they were bowing down to the sun. This is right in the temple. You know, normally you come to the temple, you worship the Most High at the temple. These men came there, turned their backs toward the temple, and began to worship the sun. That's a pretty bold statement to make. And then there were women, it says, that were making cakes for Tammuz and weeping for Tammuz. They were making cakes to the Queen of Heaven. That's what they were doing. And they were weeping for Tammuz. So what we see from the information that's given to us by these prophets is that the idolatry that the southern kingdom was practicing was from the Babylonian system. The Babylonians, they were the ones who worshiped Tammuz. That was the Babylonian deity. And the Queen of Heaven Ishtar, called the Queen of Heaven, that was the Babylonian name for their female deity. So they had embraced the same form of paganism that the northern kingdom had embraced, except they took the names of those deities that were central to the Babylonians. So we see that. Jeremiah talks about that. And that is what brought about the Babylonians, or the Most High sending the Babylonians to bring correction to his people. Mm-hmm. And so we find that when the Babylonians came in to take the southern kingdom into captivity, that it was really a work of preservation for those who would go into captivity. So Yirmiyahu was saying, King Nebuchadnezzar is going to come in. Don't fight against it. Just go ahead and go into captivity. Many of the people said, no, we don't want to do that. We're either going to fight or we're going to escape. We're going to go down to Egypt. Jeremiah said, don't go down to Egypt. He said, whoever goes down to Egypt, you're not going to survive. Mm-hmm. And then you had Jeremiah dealing with another prophet who came with a different word, saying that, no, they took some of us, but those captives that have been taken, they're going to be restored in the following year, and the Most High is going to deliver. And Jeremiah said, well, amen. He said amen to that prophecy. He said, but all of the prophets have prophesied that these things will happen. And Jeremiah, he was one of those prophets that remained consistent with hearing the word of the previous prophets. See, the reason why Israel was going into captivity was based, first of all, upon the word that the Most High gave to Moshe. When you go back into Devarim, chapter 28, the Almighty said, if you break my commandments, if you do not keep my covenant, another nation is going to come and will take you and make you captives. So that was the first prophecy, way back before the people went into the land of promise. So when Jeremiah read the prophets, read other prophets, and then heard from Elohim as to what was going to take place in his generation, when he responded to these other prophets who had a different word, you always have generation where you have one prophet saying one thing and another prophet saying another thing. How do you know which one is right? One test you can use. Go read the writings of the prophets that have preceded the prophets of the current generation. That's what you do. Because everything Elohim says, it's always consistent from one generation to the next. He's not saying something different from one generation to the next. And I know that there are those who will say that, well, there's a new paradigm shift. There's a new word for this generation. There's a new this, a new that. You know, how many of you all ever heard of that? Mm-hmm. New word, right? Mm-hmm. No, there ain't no new word. Yeah. Don't believe that. There might be new understanding for us, but the Most High, as the prophet Isaiah said, Yeshayahu said, he said that Yahuwah has declared the end at the beginning. We get a real good prophetic history when we go read the book of Hanach or Enoch. It shows us what's going to happen throughout history. So the things that we learn as we move forward, it's not a new word, and it's not new revelation. What it is us coming to a proper understanding of what Elohim has said. Because see, if you've been in the dark throughout most of your existence as a believer, in other words, you have not had a proper understanding about the truth of the scriptures. When you begin to see the layers of untruth being pulled back, it is new revelation to you, new revelation to me, but it is a proper understanding that we are receiving as it pertains to the plan and purpose of Elohim. Elohim is not like whatever generation. Well, I got a new word for this generation that's different from the other generation. No. His ways don't change from generation to generation. Now, the way he might have to maneuver things in getting his purposes accomplished might be a little different. You understand? But his commandments, his statutes, judgments, his intentions, no, they don't change. They don't change. Okay? Adultery is still adultery. You know, whatever's commanded in the book, it's still the same. That's not changed. All right? So, what we see is that with the southern kingdom, the ones who were taken into captivity were the group that would be used to preserve the line. Because what we have to remember is that there had to be a people in order for the Messiah to come. So the people had to be preserved, even if it's a remnant. Yes. Now, with the northern kingdom, and there was something that I failed to mention, but I do need to mention it. When the northern kingdom was taken into captivity, the people were removed from the land, and those who were not considered as being beneficial to the kingdom of Assyria, they were left in the land. And there were people from other nations that were placed in the land of Israel. And this other people that was placed in the land of Israel, because they did not know the Torah, they needed to be taught the Torah. Now, one might ask, well, why did they need to be taught the Torah? Because when these people came into the land, wild beasts were coming out and killing the people. Because in order to dwell in the land that belongs to Yahuwah, you have to keep his Torah. That's the reason why the tribes of Israel were removed. They were not keeping the Torah. You can't live in Yahuwah's land and not keep the Torah. So they sent a priest into the northern kingdom to teach those new transported people from other nations that were in the northern kingdom, to teach them how to keep the Torah. Those people amalgamated with those Israelites that were still in the northern kingdom, and they ended up becoming whom we call the Samaritans. That's how the Samaritans were formed. Okay? Now the Samaritans, and we'll talk about that downstream, but I'm just throwing this out because this is what happened after the Assyrians came and took the northern kingdom and made them captives. Now, the 10 tribes that were removed, the majority of them at least, they ended up going to the land of Assyria, east of Assyria. And from there, they were scattered to the ends of the earth. Okay. And at another time, I'll talk a little bit more in detail about the places that they went. Okay. And the prophecies that are related to that. But here we see that as a result of the wicked idolatrous practices that were adopted by both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, it caused both the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom to be taken into captivity. So the price that's paid for disobedience is a high price. What we see is that in Elohim's land, you must keep Elohim's Torah, or he removes you from the land. This is something that's very, very important. All right, any questions? All right, no questions, then we will have a word of prayer and close. Abba, we thank you right now for this teaching and trust that the information that has been provided has helped to inform and edify each of the students. We thank you for all that we have learned. We thank you for the lessons that we draw from this history and ask that you would continue to guide and direct our lives. Help us in our service towards you and in our personal lives. May we make choices that are appropriate according to your word. We thank you in Messiah's name. Amen. Amen. For those of you watching us by live stream, we thank you for your attendance and trust that the teaching has been encouraging, edifying, and informative. If you believe that this ministry is a blessing to you and that it is helping you to grow in your faith, we definitely like to encourage you to give and share a donation unto the Most High. Your donation helps us to continue this work that we're doing to bring the word of Elohim to the nations. You can go to our website at www.ncmmi.20m.com. You can also share by Cash App. Our Cash App code, is $NCMMI. I want to say thank you so much for your attendance and continue to pray for us that we will bring the word of Elohim to the nations just as we've been doing. May the Almighty bless you and your families. Shalom.
All right. Very good.